Good morning, everyone, and we'll go ahead and get started. Kiana, thank you for joining us for day 2 of AKAA Virtual 2021, the 48th annual meeting of the Alaska Anthropological Association. I'm Amy Phillips Chan, and I'm the president of the association. And this morning I am zooming in from the beautiful snow-covered tundra of Sitnasak, where I am fortunate to live and work here in the town of Nome on the traditional homeland of the Inupiat people. With us this morning, we have Dr. E.J.R. David, who you can see there on your screen, who will be offering a special keynote presentation, and board member Joshua Lynch, who's going to help us moderate the session. After Dr. David's presentation, there's going to be a Q&A. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat box or raise your emoji hand, and we'll have your mic unmuted. So however you feel most comfortable, we are really glad you're here. So now I have the great honor to share a few words about Dr. David. Dr. David was born in the Philippines and grew up in Pasay, Las Piñas, Makati, and Utqiagvik in Alaska. He now lives in Anchorage with his wife, who's of Koyakan Athabascan heritage, and their 4 children, whom they are raising to celebrate being 100% Filipino and 100% Athabascan. Dr. David obtained his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and Master of Arts and doctoral degrees in clinical community psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Alaska Anchorage, where he guides students through understanding and responding to issues of colonialism, intergenerational trauma, immigration, racism, sexism, and internalized oppression. Dr. David has traveled across the country as an invited workshop facilitator and speaker. He is featured in many online videos and has over 8,000 followers on Twitter. Dr. David has authored and edited 4 books on internalized oppression and colonial mentality, including Brown Skin, White Minds, Internalized Oppression, Psychology of Oppression, and We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet. He's also a contributor to Psychology Today and the Huffington Post, where he writes about the psychology of race, ethnicity, and culture. So as the Alaska Anthropological Association strives to address social inequities and support divergent histories, Dr. David is skillfully equipped to help us unpack some of these complex issues. This morning, we have the pleasure of listening to his talk, Beyond Diversity Trainings and Implicit Biases Toward an Anti-Racist and Equity Approach, and to learn about methods we can employ for taking a proactive approach to helping establish an equitable future. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Dr. David. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Let me just get set up here. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Amy Phillips Chan and the Alaska Anthropological Association for putting this conference together. As a non-anthropologist, I am deeply honored to be invited into your conference. Thank you for welcoming me here. It's a great honor to share the space with all of you. To all of you who are tuned in, thank you for spending some of your time with us. I deeply appreciate you choosing to spend this next hour listening to me. As you can see, I want to share some of my thoughts about going beyond implicit bias training and toward adopting an anti-racist and equity approach. But before I do that, as I do with every talk, I must first do some acknowledgments. First, I want to acknowledge my ancestors. Although I identify as Filipino, as it is what is most familiar to people, Filipino really is a colonial name. The peoples in the lands now known as the Philippines are very diverse. There are many ethnic and cultural groups throughout the islands. My ancestors specifically are Kapampangan, which means people of the riverbanks, and I am also Tagalog, which means people of the river. And it is them who I must acknowledge, and it is them who are with me today. Um, I also must acknowledge my family.
Hey, Dr.
um,
David, I'm
oh
so
yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are seeing your notes
Oh
on
okay.
the screen.
Oh, I wonder why. Let me see. Um, let me share again. Thanks for letting me know. Um, let me close that. Okay, here we go. So is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
So you can see the slide now, bigger. Okay,
Yes, that's great.
thank you so much. Um, yeah, and so like I said, I also want to acknowledge my family, as Dr. Phillips Chan mentioned. My wife is Koyukon Athabaskan from the village of Ruby, by the Yukon River, and together we have four children. You can see in that picture; they're much younger in this picture. Malakas, Kalayaan, Kaluguran, and our newest addition is Tala. um, so she's about a year and 4 months now. And again, even though you don't see them with me, they're always with me, just like my ancestors. I am a reflection of my family, just like I am a reflection of my ancestors. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you all from the traditional lands of the Denaina people, the Gayakak, otherwise known as Anchorage. It is here where I live and work. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I want to say is that this is not a training. Yes, I'm going to provide some like critique of implicit bias training, but I don't intend to replace that with yet another form of training. I don't intend to train you to learn a new skill. I can't do that in 40 to 50 minutes, especially a skill to address a huge, complicated, and deeply embedded but widespread issue like racism or oppression. Um, what I intend to do is to share with you a different way of thinking about these issues, a different approach to addressing them. Some of you may not like the approach. Some of you may be resistant to it, might even be hurt by it, might even see it as against your values. But I ask that you remain open, at least for the next 40 to 50 minutes. What I offer is a different way of thinking about how we got to the problems we're facing today, particularly racism and the racial inequities it has created. And so then what I'm suggesting is a different way of correcting these problems. So this is a big picture approach. So let's begin. So ever since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, championed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there has been increased attention on multiculturalism in our country. In addition to ending segregation in public places and formally outlawing discrimination based on color, race, religion, national origin, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also led to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And that Immigration Act eliminated limits or quotas on the number of immigrants allowed from non-European countries. And so this Immigration Act prioritized reuniting immigrant families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. And over the next about 4 decades since then, the policies put into effect during the 1965 Immigration Act greatly changed the demographic makeup of the United States population as immigrants entering the United States, under this new immigration policy came increasingly from countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as opposed to Europe. This contributed largely to the rapid racial and cultural diversification of the United States population. And consequently, as a response to the rapidly diversifying population of the United States, in our schools, in our workplace especially, there's also been a boom in diversity trainings. There have been task forces and committees established by organizations, governments, schools, or other entities to help people become more aware of the diversity in their circles and to be more prepared to work with diverse peoples. And among other things, these trainings tend to focus on being more sensitive to, respectful of, tolerant of, and overall just celebrating of diversity. And so since then, everyone seems to be celebrating diversity. And this is true for us here in Alaska too. For example, many of you might remember when Anchorage's diversity was big news in 2016. It surprised many, especially people who are outside of Alaska. And it became a story covered by national news outlets like CNN. And so all of a sudden, we were so proud of our diversity. And not only did Anchorage have the most diverse neighborhood in the country, we also had, the most diverse schools in our country, middle schools and high schools, right? And within these schools, we celebrated the diversity of languages that we have in them, right? So there was no doubt that Anchorage celebrates, or Alaska more generally, celebrates the diversity of our people as well as anybody in the country. Um, we even in Anchorage, at least we even have a program now that's been going on for years about, the city being a welcoming city, right? Um, Simultaneous to the growing appreciation and celebration of diversity nationwide, there was also a growing understanding of implicit bias. It's this understanding that, perhaps despite our outward expression of liking diversity and welcoming it and even celebrating it, we might still be harboring inside us a bias toward other people who are not like us. And this also started becoming popular around the 1960s. But I do want to note that some anti-bias trainings were already happening as early as the 1930s. But in the 1960s, implicit bias training became especially popular in our country. Again, this is around the civil rights movement, because at that time, to be overtly racist was becoming no longer as acceptable. It was beginning to no longer be the norm. So people's biases became more hidden, more covert, more subtle. Also, there were many people who were really genuinely well intentioned, but because of how they grew up, they nevertheless still had a preference for people who are similar to them, um, and perhaps more, wary or unsure of people that they are not familiar with. And these biases were believed to still influence people's behaviors, hiring practices, policies, decisions, ideas of attractiveness, and other things. However, although it was already being talked about a long time ago, again, like around the 1960s, the term implicit bias did not really come about and become popular until the 1990s, when a couple of psychologists, Mazarine Banaji and Anthony Greenwald, started doing a series of experiments on this. And these experiments were powerful because they were so scientifically rigorous, but they were so powerful in making people realize that they may be harboring biases against some people, even when they say they don't, or even when they are well intentioned. So this is really the beginning of the implicit bias boom. And these are the conclusions that we can get from these studies. Uh, First, what implicit bias studies have revealed is that we all have implicit biases. Number two, these biases are inside us. And number three, these biases are automatic. It exists and it operates outside of our awareness, intention, or control. And then four, biases are undesired, right? We don't want to be biased. So these are all pretty groundbreaking findings, right? And again, like I said, they were, pretty scientifically robust. However, we as a society seem to have misunderstood and distorted what implicit bias research has revealed for us. So, for example, the conclusion that we all have implicit biases have been distorted to mean that we are all racists. The finding that bias is inside us has been misinterpreted to mean that racism is inside us and that it only happens on the individual level, like interpersonally between people. Number three, the finding that biases are automatic has been distorted to mean that there's nothing that we can do about it. And then four, the finding that we don't like to be biased, that biases are undesired, has led to the solution that, well, to correct it, we must become unbiased. So these distortions, let's break down these distortions and misunderstandings, right? Focusing on the first two first. Let's break down what racism really means. So racism is a form of oppression. And just because we have implicit racial biases, it doesn't mean that we are all racists. Racism, again, is a form of oppression. And for someone to be oppressive, there needs to be power and privilege inequalities that exist. There are different kinds of oppression. Oppression can be based on race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And all of these types can be expressed or manifested either blatantly or subtly or intentionally or unintentionally. So many times today, the subtle and unintentional forms of oppression have been termed microaggressions. Many of you may have heard that. And then all forms of oppression, racism in our case here today, exist and operate on three levels: interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. We focus on two levels today, just the interpersonal and institutional levels. The third one, internalized, calls for a totally separate session. Okay, so to dismantle the first two misunderstandings about implicit bias, that we are all racists and that racism is inside us and happens only in the individual level, let's focus on the definition of oppression, the two P's of oppression: power and privilege. As you can see right here in this example, the two people are inherently equal. The two people are represented by these two circles right here. They are the same size, right? So they can be mean to each other. They can be rude to each other. But meanness and rudeness doesn't equate to oppression. In this example, you see that the target is a woman and the agent is a man. So the type of oppression in this example is sexism. But you can easily apply this to racism, heterosexism, or ableism as well. You also see in this example that what makes them unequal is that one person's values, perspectives, ways of doing things, and worldviews are supported by society through its policies, laws, traditions, standard operating procedures, etc., while the ways and humanity of the other person, the woman's, is not supported or backed or protected by society. This is the power and privilege and equality in oppression. These are the two P's. This is the state of oppression, this imbalance that we see right here. And if we continue to ignore this or justify it, then we are perpetuating the imbalance. That is the process of oppression. So, because of the historic and modern day imbalance in terms of power and privilege, a Black person cannot be racist toward a white person. There's no such thing as reverse racism, or reverse sexism, or reverse ableism, because the power and privilege sits in the race example. It sits with the white person and not the Black person. A Black person can be unkind, rude, and even prejudiced or biased against the white person, but that is not racism. Racial bias or prejudice is not the same as racism. So yeah, even though we might all have biases and prejudices, as implicit bias research suggests, right? Not all of us can be racists. And so what are we trying to do is to have equality between people, to get our society and our institutions and systems to a place where it protects, backs up, or supports all people. Unfortunately, we're not there. And the current state of our society is that there is imbalance. There's a state of oppression between people. And so again, bias or prejudice isn't oppression. So although we might all have biases, we are not all racists. Racism also doesn't just happen between people, as you can see right here, between the two circles. Um, it's not just interpersonal. There's also institutional level oppression, and that's where the power and privilege imbalance comes in. So now that we've corrected the two misunderstandings about implicit bias, um, let's now focus on the other ways that we have misunderstood the findings of implicit bias research. Number three is the misunderstanding that because it's automatic, then there's nothing we can do about it. And then lastly, the misunderstanding that if we're going to address it, then the goal is to become unbiased, right? To get to a neutral point. And these misunderstandings really have led to distorted goals. Many people have misunderstood the goal as to become colorblind. Many of you may have heard that before. For those of us who do acknowledge that racism still exists, and again, not all people do, the typical quick go-to buzzword of an answer to solve racism is to not see race, because seeing race has been regarded as the cause of racism. Being colorblind also comes in when someone says something like, I don't care what your color is or what race you are. I don't even see or consider race at all. Some people even dream for future generations of children to not even know what the color of their skin is, believing that such color blindness is the solution to racism. And because being racist has been acknowledged as the issue, many people have understandably misunderstood the goal as becoming non-racist. And because of the focus on individual level solutions, many people have misunderstood the goal as simply to be kind, sensitive, or respectful. Just focus on making individual level changes. And because of the automaticity finding, many people have misunderstood that as there's not much we can do about it. So they become passive. And if they don't get passive, the farthest they go is to just take care of themselves. That as long as they see themselves as not biased, as long as they are not racist, then that's all that matters. And because of these misunderstandings, the solutions we have come up with and have emphasized reflect these misunderstandings. We've regarded the solution as implicit bias training, for example. Implicit bias trainings have become en vogue. People cannot stand that they may be harboring biases inside them. And so we see implicit bias trainings pop up everywhere now. And here you can see an example of how we've equated, bias with racism with this orange flyer that you see right here. um, we see the popularity of implicit bias training in our home state as well. Here's an Anchorage and Fairbanks example. And we also see how we have mistakenly equated bias with racism. For example, the Anchorage police chief, when questioned about racism, their response is to address implicit bias and to do implicit bias training, focusing just on the mindset, right, of their force. So mistakenly believing that racism only happens also in the individual level. So implicit bias training is everywhere. And lots of resources are being spent on it. Lots of people's times are being spent on it. For example, some estimates have implicit bias trainings costing around $25,000 to $450,000 a year. It's a huge range because a lot of that depends on what the organization's needs are. And then also organizations need to also factor in the time that their employees spend away from their work to go to these trainings. So these trainings cost a lot, but it's not even effective. Research shows that implicit bias trainings don't work very well, especially for the long term. Research also shows that it doesn't really change people's behaviors. Also, if implicit bias is racism, like we have mistakenly equated it to, then why do we still have racism today, given that we are now aware of our implicit biases and have been doing the work on ourselves for years now to eliminate the biases, right? So this is because racism is not just implicit bias. Racism is not just inside us. Racism is not just interpersonal. And racism definitely isn't something passive that just automatically happens. Instead, racism is active. Again, it's not passive, it's active. As you can see right here, hate crimes based on race and also based on other social identities, many of which is related to race, have reached an all-time high. There are many people and many groups that are actively perpetuating racism. And in an actively racist world, being passively non-racist is not enough. You may be non-racist, and that's good for you, but that doesn't challenge racism much, perhaps at all. Here are some of the highlights, or I should say lowlights, of the FBI report showing that racism against different racial groups, hate crimes against different racial groups are still very prevalent. I'm not going to read all of that in detail. But we also see racism here in Alaska. In Anchorage, for example, this is an article published by Green and Chamard in 2013. And it shows that peoples of color in Anchorage report high levels of racist experiences from other people. So interpersonal experiences of racism while they're at work, while shopping, while at school, from police, from a judge, lawyer, while trying to buy a house, etc. We also see racism in Alaska in the institutional level. An example of this is the disproportionately high rates of incarceration among Black people and Native people. Black people compose about 3% of the Alaskan population, but 7% of our jail population. Native people compose about 20% of the state population, but compose almost 40% of our jail population. So, statistics show us also that Native Americans are being killed by police at a higher rate than any other racial group in the country. And here in Alaska, if you're Native, you have the highest likelihood of being killed by police here than in any other state except for New Mexico. So in addition to racism being active, racism is also systemic. Racism isn't just how people treat other people, it is also how systems and institutions differentially treat people. And in a world where racism is in our culture, our policies, our procedures, our systems, addressing individual level bias, even if that bias is indeed racism, which we just talked about is not, um, addressing individual level bias is not enough. Here are some more examples of racial inequities. Here we see the racial disparities in terms of sexual assault victims. Again, so much evidence that racism is widespread and systemic. It doesn't just happen on the individual level. Here are some examples of systemic racism in the educational context. And also racial disparities in health, largely due to historical racism. And we also see racial disparities in terms of power. In a world, in a city as diverse as Anchorage, a state as diverse as Alaska, simply celebrating diversity isn't enough. We must see that people in positions of power, the people in privilege, the people with decision-making power are still not diverse at all. In Anchorage, we've never had a person of color serve as mayor. We've never had a person of color serve as the state governor in Alaska, right? Who are the wealthy? Who are the leaders? Who's getting paid the most, right? Who has the wealth? What are we teaching in our schools? Whose histories and perspectives and cultures and traditions are we emphasizing and privileging and regarding as the real indicators of intelligence? It seems like the more diverse we are, the clearer the disparities and inequalities are, right? So what are we really celebrating? So we see examples of racism in our everyday lives, in our interactions with each other, but also in our systems, institutions, media, our culture. Racism is all around us. And this is where it's important to highlight perhaps one of the most critical misunderstandings, the most important thing about implicit bias that people tend to not know or ignore. And that is that we're not born with implicit bias. They are not genetic. Implicit biases are learned. The implicit biases we have inside us are formed or shaped or taught by our environment. Implicit biases are the product, the result, and not the root. The root of the problem is our environment, an environment that does not expose us enough to other people's, and when it does, it presents a distorted, stereotypical, or inaccurate picture of other people's. It is that creates these implicit biases. So simply changing things in our minds, changing things on the individual level, like what implicit bias training does, it's futile if we continue to live in an environment that will just recreate and encourage those biases again. So we continue to live in a racist world. Racial inequalities and disparities continue to exist. Racism continues to exist despite our diversity and despite many efforts to address or eliminate implicit biases. Despite efforts to be kind to each other and be respectful and be sensitive. And we went over some of the main reasons this doesn't work, right? Because they just try to go to the neutral place. They lead to passivity, and they are focused only on the individual. So what can we do? Well, I think what we need is a shift in our approach. So let's get there now. Many of you may have seen this meme before, but this meme is misleading and inaccurate in many ways. Let me break it down. First, why are the people different sizes, implying that the inequalities are natural. The inequalities are not because some people are born less than other people or are inferior to other people. The inequalities are not inherent. The inequalities are not natural. Instead, the inequalities are structural and institutional, as we talked about earlier. The meme also doesn't go back enough to explain how and who created such institutional inequalities and who benefits from the maintenance of such institutions or systems. So we need to have a more accurate and true understanding of what really happened and what is really going on. And what you see there is baseball. Like, that's we're not going to go that far. Like, who decided that we needed to watch baseball anyway? But anyway, so we need to correct this, right? And so let's try to correct this. First, all peoples are equal. I think that's a value that we all would like to believe. And if not, if you don't believe all people are equal, then you must really take a long, serious look into that belief. So all people are equal. We are born equal. Then some people chose or decided that it's an important part of life to watch baseball. And again, this is just a metaphor. It can be a metaphor to, the decision that it's important to learn English, or that it's important to learn Greek mythology, or that it's important to learn about Shakespeare, or that it's important to be a Christian, or that it's important to have a house or have a car, or whatever else is our definition of success, or being educated, or being enlightened, or being advanced, or civilized, or developed might be, right? And so they convince other people that this is important for everybody, but they need the resources, the land, the labor of other people to quote unquote get ahead or be able to watch baseball better. And so now we begin to see the beginning of structural or institutional differences. We begin to see who created it and who's benefiting from it. Now, what could have been done to address this? We could have nipped this in the bud earlier and just gave back the resources. But instead of giving back resources, we didn't, because now we feel entitled to the resources. We've convinced ourselves that we deserve it more than others, that it's our manifest destiny to own lands and resources, or that we worked hard for it, and it would be an injustice if we give it back or share it. And so instead, we looked for other resources, other land. But the problem is other people are already on that land too. And so then we convince those other people too that it's important for them to watch baseball. And so we also exploit them through colonialism and forced labor, slavery, other ways of exploitation like cheap labor and stolen resources, so that we can watch baseball better. And so then this is where we end up. Now, this is a more accurate representation, a more accurate meme of inequalities. Again, the imbalance is not natural. It's not because individuals are different sizes. It's not because of individual failings. The imbalance is institutional. Also, it didn't happen automatically or passively or by accident. Racial imbalance, racism, was and is intentional. It is an active process. This is the same as we talked about earlier, in that the imbalance is not between people, but with the norms and institutions that encourage, support, benefit, or protect some people but not others. That's where oppression is. That's where racism is. So the reality is that there is racial inequality. So what is the possible solution for inequality? You know, for many people, it makes logical sense that the solution to inequality is equality. This is similar to how the logical solution to bias is to become unbiased, to become neutral, to be colorblind. This is similar to how the logical solution to being racist is to become non-racist. Right? So equality is the logical solution to address inequality. And at first glance, it makes sense. You know, equality seems, you know, like a good solution. It's a logical solution. It also looks good, right? It presents good optics. You treat everyone the same, give everyone the same things. You treat everyone the same. You know, it promotes this idea of sameness, right? And I say here the illusion of fairness. So equality is not controversial. Equality looks like the best solution to inequality. So let's see what happens if we use the equality approach and not have bias, be neutral, and not see color, and just simply treat everyone the same. So as you can see, when we use the equality approach, we don't eliminate the problem at all. So let's see that again. We start right here, and if we use the equality approach, we do not eliminate the problem at all. This is because an equality approach can only work if everyone starts from the same place. An equality approach does not correct for historical and contemporary injustices. It does not correct for it. And an equality approach to an unequal reality only maintains inequality, perhaps even worsens it. Besides, where did we get additional resources? Did we colonize other lands and other people to bring us up to this? So anyway, again, an equality approach doesn't work because it just leads to being neutral or colorblind in an imbalanced and racist world. It also leads us to simply being passively non-racist when being passively non-racist in an actively racist world is not enough to address the problem. An equality approach still allows the problem, racism and racial inequalities, to continue. It is well-intentioned, an equality approach, but it is nevertheless harmful. An equality approach is similar to a pull yourself by your bootstraps mentality because it assumes that we live in an equal world, when in reality we live in an unequal, oppressive world. An equality approach is another example of symbolic racism. We must understand that equality is the goal, not the solution. So what can we do? And here's the shift that I'm advocating for. Instead of an equality approach, we need to shift toward an equity approach. This means giving everyone what they need to be successful. An equity approach acknowledges that there are differences between people and what they need to succeed. An equity approach acknowledges that the differences between people are not inherent, but instead are systemic and institutionalized differences in how people have been treated historically and contemporarily. An equity approach acknowledges and actively corrects for the injustices of the past, and also the exploitations of the past, and also of today. And it breaks down the unjust systems that have been built to benefit some people while keeping others down. What a shift towards an equity approach does, right, is that it turns the belief that the solution is to become unbiased or neutral or colorblind toward being color conscious and color affirming. Instead of regarding some racial groups as less than, which is racism, we don't just go to not seeing colors at all. We must go beyond and regard those racial groups as beautiful, as strong. We need to correct for the generations of denigration. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamt of a society wherein we are not judged by the color of our skin. He did not dream of a society that does not see colors. There's a big difference. Also, we can't just go from being racist to being non-racist. It's not enough. We need to continuously and actively fight racism, right? Racism is an active process, so we can't just be passively non-racist. We need to be on the offensive. And so with these recommendations, we already see that we need to go from being passive to active. We can't just take care of ourselves and let the world continue being racist. We must go out there, participate, and actively fight racism. And so then an equity approach will not just address individual level bias, but also change the norms, the policies, the standard operating procedures that continue to perpetuate racism. We also need to shift from seeing racism as an individual level problem towards seeing racism as a structural or institutional level problem. So how might this shift look like in real life? Well, here are some examples. A move toward an equity approach might mean that instead of not seeing color or not considering cultural factors, we affirm it. We need to validate the experiences of people, their struggles. We need to regard and value their perspectives, their ways, their values, their languages, their worldviews as just as legitimate and as real as the dominant Western ones. We must also prioritize people's histories. We must overhaul our educational systems and devote our resources and time to correcting the generations of systematic erasure and distortion of such histories. This means we prioritize the hiring and paying, and that's paying with many exclamation points, of people who can help us teach such histories and perspectives. We must devote our resources to training and hiring and paying people to do this, even if it means the elimination of other things, especially things that we have been prioritizing now since this country was built. We must change our standards or definitions of success to make them more inclusive of how historically oppressed groups conceptualize or define success. Perhaps the ability to frame switch should be a quality we look for in a leader or employee or CEO or mayor or governor. You know, perhaps that's a quality that we look for in who we vote for as our leaders. Perhaps a degree or some courses in ethnic studies or critical race theory should be a requirement in our hiring practices. Perhaps such courses should be required in our schools. For those of us in positions of power, we must use our power to make these large systemic changes happen. We must use our connections, our social capital, our influence to convince people of the importance and necessity of these systemic changes. In fact, this shift doesn't just call on us to use our power, but to even sacrifice it or risk losing it in order to make these systemic changes. This might mean using up or giving up our own resources so historically oppressed peoples can move up. This might mean giving up our positions of power or stepping aside so that historically oppressed peoples can get to that position. And as you can see, all of these require active and effortful and difficult and also continuous and long-term engagement. There's nothing quick or easy about this. Like a 1-hour implicit bias training or a 1-month celebration of diversity. There's nothing easy about this. It requires us to give up a lot of our comfort and a lot of our privileges. There's nothing passive about this. It requires sustained hard work. And this forces us to go beyond just us, beyond changing ourselves, and toward changing our systems and institutions. By using an equity approach to address inequality, then we can truly go from here to here. So in summary, the reality is that the systems in our world are racially inequitable. The inequalities are structural and institutional. Color blindness will only hide and maintain racially inequitable systems. The inequities were human-made, and they are human-maintained. And so then humans can create more racially equitable systems. But to do this, humans must actively, and again, emphasis on actively, challenge, dismantle, reimagine, and create more racially equitable systems. Right? And to challenge inequitable systems, to change racial inequality, we cannot use an equality approach. An equality approach may look good and project fairness, but it cannot change an inequitable system. An equality approach will only maintain a racially inequitable system. An equity approach is risky and may not produce good optics, but it is what is necessary. And to be a true ally, to be an accomplice in addressing a racially inequitable system, we need to take risks and do what is necessary. To be the leaders that will address racial inequities, we need to be willing to take risks and have bad optics. We need to use our power and privileges, risk it even, to do the right and necessary thing. As leaders, as people who are in positions of power, we need to be ready and willing to get into necessary trouble, as civil rights icon John Lewis asked us to do. So in conclusion, addressing racism is hard work. To successfully challenge racism and racial inequalities, we must have a sustained, long-term, perhaps perpetual or never-ending commitment to it. It cannot just be a 1 hour, the 1 hour that we spent here together today, or the diversity training that you did last month, or the book that you are reading every night. It has to be all the time, and perhaps forever. We also can't just be satisfied with being not racist and just stand by and let actively racist people continue to inflict damage. We must actively challenge and fight racism. We must conspire to dismantle policies and organizations and institutions that are perpetuating racism. We might all be good people. We might not have implicit biases, or perhaps we're working on ourselves to eliminate implicit biases. We might not be racist, but the systems in our world is. And many people in our world are. So even if we're truly good people, doing nothing beyond, ourselves, changing nothing beyond ourselves won't change much. We must remember that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. David, for that really thoughtful presentation and for kind of walking us through kind of this shift from an equality to an equity approach and how we can become active participants in the process. So we have a few minutes now for questions and answers, a Q&A session with all of you. So if you would like to ask Dr. David a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box. Joshua Lynch is here with us as well, and he will help kind of read out some of those questions. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute your mic, and so you can visit with us in person, however you feel most comfortable. So we have a question here from Marina asking, would it be possible to share a list of the books you authored? So maybe a place for more information.
Yeah, definitely. So I authored 3 of them, co-authored 1, and then edited 1. So, so it's not just me working on them. There's a lot of people that have helped me do them. I just want to say that the most recent one, We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet, is perhaps the most, I guess, personal of all of them. The other 3 are, quite your typical academic book, using, academic jargon and so on. But the 4th one is a collection of letters that I wrote to my family. That I wrote to my Filipino Athabascan family. I call them Philibaskans, by the way. Yeah, but because to me, as much research and as much work as I do, on these topics, and perhaps this is true for many of us here. For us, these are not just research. These are not just numbers. These are not just statistics. That we are interested in. For many of us, this is our lived reality. This is our life. So for example, the statistics suggesting that 1 out of 2 Native women are victims of sexual violence. Well, I have 3 Native women in my household. Who are you talking about that is going to be a victim of sexual violence, right? So to me, yes, I do work on this, and this is my research, and I write about it academically, but this is also, it goes way deeper than that for me. This is my life, and I, it comes with a lot of anxieties. It comes with a lot of fears. But yeah, so that 4th book, We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet, is written in a very personal way. But I can, if you go to my website, my books are listed on there, and there's only 4. It's not like you're gonna lose track of them. You can find them. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Great, thank you. We have another question. The amount of work that is required from us to create an equitable system is profound. Do you have advice for how individuals can perhaps focus our efforts?
Yeah, no, it is profound. As I said, it's going to require sustained, long-term engagement, and it's going to require putting ourselves in very difficult and uncomfortable situations, and even giving up a lot of the power and the privileges and the resources that perhaps we feel we've achieved and deserved, right? But given up and a lot of that and even sacrificing it and risk losing it. Um, but to me, on a more, I guess, simpler level, we cannot just wake up every morning anymore. Uh, you know, just simply, having the mindset of, not being racist, right? Again, because this is an actively racist world, and so I think if all of us wake up every day with a mindset of how can I fight racism today, not with the mindset of how can I be not racist today, but how can I be, fighting racism today. So even that little shift, I think, in our own individual mindsets, it can make some difference. Because, you know, we have, like I said earlier, we can have a racist world without any racist people. Because this is systemic, right? This is in our policies, this is in our institutions, and so if we can get all of these supposedly non-racist people to start being actively anti-racist, to start changing these policies and institutions, then I think we can start seeing some changes. So even if it's just one thing every day, ask yourself, how can I fight racism today? Not how can I be not racist today, but how can I fight racism today? That might make a difference.
Great, thank you. Speaking again to the active manner that we should participate here. We have another question from participants. This one asks, addressing multiracial families are important anywhere. How do we try to change views of racism that are microaggressions that might happen every day? How would you reply to someone that may have commented poorly in a day-to-day experience?
Yeah. This is a great question, and it's something that I think many of us have to deal with on a daily basis. First, I just want to give a shout out to one of my good friends, Dr. Kevin Nadal, who is one of the leading scholars on microaggressions. So you should really check out his work. Kevin Nadal, Nadal is his last name. So you can check out his books and his articles, and I'm sure you will find many useful advice in his work. But for now, just to address your question, I just want to say that there are, I guess, more gracious and perhaps effective ways to respond to microaggressions. It's almost like it's hard because if we put the onus of responsibility on the victims of microaggressions to be the ones to always correct, to be the ones to always point out and correct, that these are microaggressions, and also while thinking about how can I put this in a way that will not offend this person. You see what I mean? So it's almost like unfair that you're putting the responsibility on the person who was the victim of microaggression to make sure that they don't offend you, to make sure that they worry about, your feelings when it was their feelings that was harmed to begin with, right? So for us, I think, so let me, I guess, flip the question a little bit, and instead of responding to microaggressions, I just want to ask all of us, because all of us commit microaggressions. I just want to ask all of us to, to be open, right? To people who call us out when we do commit microaggressions. And instead of seeing that as offensive, right? Like if somebody calls you out and us feeling hurt or offended by it because we might assume that somebody's accusing us of being racist or sexist or whatever, right? Maybe we should consider that as a favor, that perhaps we should thank the person for calling us out, and for showing us better. um, then I think that can be a more productive beginning than if we're already bumping heads right from the get-go. So the onus of responsibility should be on the perpetrator and not on the target.
Excellent.
And also, I just want to say, right? I also just want to say this, because for those of us now who are often targets of microaggressions, again, we find ourselves in a very difficult dilemma, right? Do we respond? Do we try to teach? Do we have the energy and the capacity, right, to teach? And are we safe? So that's the important thing too. Like, is it safe to do that? Is it safe to speak out against it? Or if by speaking out, are we putting ourselves in danger, right? And danger can come in many ways. It could be actual physical danger, or it could be psychological harm, or it could be, if I speak out, I might lose my job, or if I speak out, I might damage my relationship with this person, right? So so there's a lot of potential drawbacks and consequences, negative consequences, that can come out of speaking out. And for those of us who often find ourselves in that dilemma, I don't want you to feel like you're weak. I don't want you to feel like you're a sellout. I don't want you to feel like that you're a coward if you do decide that you're not going to speak up, right? Sometimes survival is just another form of bravery, especially surviving in a very racist world. um, to me, that's already a sign of strength and a sign of resilience. So I hope you don't feel like you're weak, or that you're not brave enough if you do decide that you're not gonna speak out against every microaggression that you experience.
Yeah, those are some really good thoughts. Also, the feeling of being burnt out, right? When you're having to respond all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we have another question here. How do you feel academia, and specifically fields of anthropology and your field of psychology, can work to be anti-racist?
Wow. Oh my goodness. So I don't know much about anthropology, but I think academia in general, just basing it off of my experience with psychology, um, there's been some movements on this, especially, I don't know, maybe the pandemic has facilitated this, or maybe the pandemic has exposed a lot of holes in our institutions. But one tangible example that I see now is that a lot of programs are not requiring standardized tests anymore for their admissions processes, like tests like SATs and ACTs, or even graduate programs. Many programs now are not requiring the GREs anymore, for their admissions. And I think that's been long overdue. And I think the pandemic may have kind of facilitated that process. So I think that's one tangible way, is if the more that we can, one, identify that many of the um, requirements or criteria that we've come up with, uh, um, are highly influenced by our values, and by dominant values more specifically, and in this case Western values, and that it's not as easily accessible, and therefore it's not equitable for all people. The program that I teach in, for instance, the doctoral program in the University of Alaska Anchorage, the psychology doctoral program in the University of Alaska Anchorage, we are now going on our 15th year of existence, but we've never required GREs from our applicants. Um, and but because that's right from the get-go, we understood that, because we have a rural emphasis, it's easy for us to see here in Alaska, right? Because we have a rural emphasis, we know that that'll put a lot of rural people, and especially then mostly indigenous people, at a disadvantage. um, if they don't have access to GRE classes and then GRE testing sites. You see what I mean? um, so we saw that, like, right from the get-go, but that is because we live in Alaska and we were in a unique position. It was easy for us to see that. You see what I mean? But for many of us in academia, I think there are many traditions and many rituals that were developed a long time ago, for white people, with white values, and with the assumption that those requirements and values will and should apply to everybody. But I think we can start to question them now. Um, you know, uh, yeah, perhaps think of alternative ways, to evaluate people, alternative ways to allow students to show us what they are capable of. Yeah. So that's a very general answer with a very specific example, but I hope that helps some. And again, it's not easy, right? Academia is, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years of institution, right? And many of our practices, many of our beliefs are so solidified, and so it's hard to challenge them. And those of us who are in positions of power now, those of us who are tenured, those of us who are, perhaps in positions of power, like, higher level administrators, you know, then it really falls on us, to make these systemic changes and not leave it on, the younger junior scholars, to risk their careers, for these changes. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we're also speaking maybe perhaps about an interdisciplinary approach within our academic institutions, right? To make this kind of more holistic perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
moving beyond our fields, our academic boundaries. We have another question here. You suggested we look for leaders, mayors, CEOs, governor, etc., who can frame shift. Can you please define frame shift for us and maybe provide an example of someone you see who has that quality?
Oh, yeah, it's maybe I won't get, I don't want to end up endorsing people running for office right now. No, but I use that as an example, right? Frame switching. For those of you who may not be familiar with frame switching, frame switching is this phenomenon that many people are able to. Actually, all of us, frame switch in one form or another. Many of us learn, for example, that there are appropriate ways of behaving when you're in a funeral, and that's, and there are appropriate ways of behaving when you're at a park, right? So we frame switch, we understand that. In our case here today, when we talk about frame switching cross-culturally, perhaps, when we look for um, uh, I'm trying to think of a word here. I guess when we're trying to look for qualifications, what we consider to be desirable qualities, right? For people who are running for office, or, trying to get a job, perhaps, being able to, frame switch cross-culturally, cross-racially. Some might even conceptualize that as, maybe multicultural competence, right? To be able to competently interact with people, from different cultures and from different racial groups. Perhaps that's a skill that has become very important in our highly diverse world, right? And so therefore that should be a skill that we emphasize and that we prioritize when we're looking for our leaders. And that people who are trying to be our leaders but have not demonstrated any kind of, cross-cultural competence, right, should be deemed unqualified. Full stop, right there already. Just like we say, well, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you're not qualified, right? Well, maybe we can say the same thing. If you have not demonstrated that you are, multiculturally competent, right, then you're not qualified. Sorry. So that's what I mean by perhaps there are different skills, different qualifications, that we can now identify and also institutionalize, right? Just like we've institutionalized many other requirements. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that really thoughtful answer. I think it kind of goes along with the anthropological idea of the reflexive approach as well. When we're in a situation, being able to look back on ourselves and the implicit biases that we bring to whatever setting that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we have a time for a couple more questions and they're just coming through the chat box. So if you're okay, we'll tackle another one here. Okay, this question asks, what ways should instructors or researchers be trying to change the field?
Again, I think there are different, I guess, pedagogies for teaching. And to me, one of the more important ones. And again, I'm not claiming to be perfect, or I'm not claiming to be, the best instructor or professor in any way. But what I try to do with my students is I try to approach it in a collaborative way too. And perhaps you do this a lot in anthropology as well, in research. But I try to apply, I try to use a collaborative approach into my teaching, in that I have, a lot of student engagement in the way that the material is presented, and also in the way that's, and also in what materials are brought into the class. So I give students a lot of control over that as well. I give them a lot of control over what topics they feel are important to talk about. And is relevant to their, personal experiences as well. And that is because, I feel that students, a big part of learning, I should say, a big part of learning is one, um, you know, people need to, get to a place of discomfort. I don't think growth or learning can come out of, staying in our comfort zones all the time. And so I think that's one. We need to be challenged. We need to talk about things that are difficult for us. We need to put ourselves in positions where we are uncomfortable. But then two, I also find it important that students need to see themselves um, in in the topics, in the material that we cover in class. um, I think there's a lot of liberation, especially for students who are from historically marginalized groups. I think there's a lot of liberation that can come out of seeing themselves in in the materials that we cover in the classroom. um, and so that's been, that's a little, I guess, flavor of my approach. But again, there's many different approaches. There's, different kind of pedagogies um, that uh, professors and instructors can use. Yeah. Also, I just want to say, I'm sorry, but I just want to say, and I was telling Dr. Phillips Chan um, earlier today that I actually have jury duty. Um, and so I have to call into my jury duty here soon. I see all of these questions popping up, but I'm sorry, we might not have time to address all of them.
We're just going to put your email address in the chat box. That's okay, Dr. David?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Please feel free to email me, and I'll try my best to respond. I have 38,000 unread emails. So if that tells you something, so try to email me, and then I'll try my best to respond.
That is definitely a record. Oh my goodness.
I'm not lying. It's right there. 38,000. So.
Wow. Well, thank you so much again for carving out some time this morning to meet with us, to share that wonderful presentation and just your thoughts and how we can move towards this more equitable approach, not only in our careers, but in our everyday lives. And thanks everybody for joining us this morning to hear Dr. David. And just a couple quick notes as we're getting ready to break for our short morning break. And we're going to resume again at 10:40 here in room A with the session, What Not to Do in Academia, Lessons Learned from the Trenches. And in room B, we'll have Revitalizing Collections. So that's a separate link. And both of these links can be found in your Zoom registration confirmation email. So please, if you want, you could give a virtual clapping of the hands applause to Dr. David for sharing with us today.